I'm Joyce, 36 female. I live in a city that I helped build, not with bricks and mortar, but with deals, strategies, and sleepless nights. For my entire adult life, I've been the COO of Sterling Innovations, my father's company, the legacy my grandfather started. My life was the company, and the company was my family. But I'm about to tell you the story of how the two people I should have been able to trust most, my own father and cousin, tried to burn it all to the ground with me inside it, not realizing I was the one holding the fire extinguisher. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Growing up, the scent of fresh blueprints and the low hum of manufacturing equipment were my version of lullabies. Sterling Innovations wasn't just my father's business, it was the third parent in our household. My grandfather, a brilliant engineer with a heart of gold, founded it in his garage. He built it on a simple principle: create the best product and treat your people like family. By the time my father, Arthur Sterling, took over, it was a respected, mid-sized manufacturing firm known for its quality and integrity. I was groomed to be the third generation, the one who would take us into the future. I didn't just accept this path, I embraced it. I got my MBA from a top-tier university, not because my father demanded it, but because I was genuinely passionate about the business. I wanted to understand every gear, every spreadsheet, every human element that made Sterling Innovations tick. For 15 years, I worked my way up. I started in logistics during summer breaks, moved to project management after college, and eventually, after proving myself 10 times over, was named Chief Operating Officer. It wasn't nepotism, it was a meritocracy of one. My father was a demanding boss, and he was even harder on me than anyone else. "You have to be better than everyone just to be seen as equal, Joyce," he'd say, a mantra that I took to heart. I streamlined our supply chain, saving the company millions. I spearheaded our digital transformation, bringing a legacy company into the 21st century. I negotiated deals that our competitors thought were impossible. I didn't just work for the company, I bled for it. My personal life was a string of postponed dates and missed social events, all sacrificed at the altar of Sterling Innovations. My office, with its panoramic view of the city skyline, felt more like home than my quiet, sterile apartment. This gilded cage was comfortable, though. I had my father's respect, or so I thought. I had the admiration of our employees, people I'd known since I was a child. I had a purpose. The only real annoyance in my professional life was my cousin, Cameron. Cameron was my aunt's son, a kid who floated through life on a cloud of privilege and unearned confidence. He was charming, I'll give him that. He could talk his way into any room, but he couldn't think his way out of a paper bag. He'd bounced from major to major in college, finally graduating with a communications degree that seemed to have taught him little about actual communication. Arthur, in a moment of familial obligation, gave him a job in the marketing department. It was a disaster. Cameron's idea of a marketing campaign was posting blurry photos on social media with nonsensical captions. He was late, lazy, and viewed his job as a personal expense account. I tried to mentor him, to guide him. "Cameron," I'd say gently, pulling him into my office after he'd missed another crucial deadline, "the details matter. You can't just wing it in this business." He'd flash that easy smile and say, "Don't worry, Joyce, I've got it handled. You worry too much." Then he'd go back to scrolling through his phone. My father saw his ineptitude, of course. He would often complain to me in private. "That boy has no work ethic," he'd grumble. "He's got your aunt's charm, but none of your grandfather's grit." I always assumed that was the end of it. Cameron was a nuisance, a family favor we had to endure, but ultimately harmless. He was a gnat in the grand machinery of the company I ran. I never, in my wildest dreams, saw him as a threat. That was my first mistake. My second was believing that my father's love for me was unconditional and separate from my utility to him. The change was subtle at first. Arthur started having closed-door meetings with Cameron. When I asked about them, he was evasive. "Just trying to light a fire under the boy," he'd say. "Give him some responsibility." Then, Cameron started shadowing Arthur, attending high-level meetings he had no business being in. He'd sit silently in the corner, a self-satisfied smirk on his face, absorbing information he couldn't possibly understand. The senior staff were confused. They'd shoot me questioning glances, and I'd fur a tight, reassuring smile, pretending I knew what was going on. In reality, a cold knot of dread was forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. The dynamics of our world were shifting, and I was being deliberately left out of the loop. My attempts to talk to my father were met with a new kind of paternalistic dismissal. "Joyce, you're doing a wonderful job running the day-to-day, but I need to think about the big picture, the future." When I pressed him on what that future looked like, he'd clap me on the shoulder and say, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it." The phrase, one he hadn't used since I was a teenager, was like a slap in the face. It was meant to put me in my place, to remind me that despite my title and accomplishments, I was still just his little girl in his eyes. He started questioning my decisions, things he would have rubber-stamped a month prior. He nitpicked my quarterly reports I'd been preparing the same way for years. He was building a case, creating a narrative of my incompetence that existed only in his mind. The atmosphere in the executive suite grew tense. The open, collaborative environment I had fostered was replaced by whispers and sideways glances. My team was loyal, but they were also scared. They saw the writing on the wall long before I was willing to read it. They knew the king was looking for a reason to exile his heir, and a new, wholly unprepared prince was waiting in the wings. I, however, was still trapped in the gilded cage of my own loyalty, unable to believe that my own father would ever truly betray me. The day it happened began like any other Tuesday. I was in the office by 6:30 a.m., a habit ingrained in me since my first day. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across my meticulously organized desk. I had a full day ahead, a logistics review at 9, a call with our German suppliers at 11, and a budget meeting with the department heads at 2. It was a normal, packed schedule, the kind that made me feel alive and purposeful. There was no premonition, no dark cloud hanging in the air. It was just Tuesday. Around 8:45 a.m., my father's executive assistant, a woman I'd known for 20 years, called my office line. Her voice was strained, unnaturally formal. "Joyce, your father would like to see you in the main conference room. Immediately." Not his office, the conference room, the one reserved for board meetings and major client negotiations. A chill snaked its way down my spine. "Is everything all right, Susan?" I asked. There was a pause. "Just," he said immediately, "Joyce." I walked the long hallway, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps. The portraits of my grandfather and a younger version of my father stared down at me, their painted eyes seeming to follow me with a mixture of pride and pity. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the scene that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. My father, Arthur, stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, his expression grim and unreadable. Next to him, looking deeply uncomfortable and important all at once, stood Cameron. And at the other end of the table was a man I didn't recognize, a stern-faced individual in a severe suit who could only be one thing, a lawyer, but he wasn't our corporate counsel. I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. He cleared his throat and looked at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "Joyce, we've decided to make a change in the company's leadership structure. Effective immediately, your position as Chief Operating Officer has been eliminated." The words didn't register at first. They sounded like a foreign language. Eliminated, I looked from my father's stoic face to Cameron's pathetic attempt at a solemn expression. The lawyer remained impassive, a statue of corporate doom. "Eliminated? What are you talking about? We just landed the biggest contract in the company's history. Our efficiency is up 18% year over year. What possible reason?" Arthur held up a hand, cutting me off. "The board has decided that we need to go in a new direction, a fresh perspective." "The board?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "You and I are the board. There are only 3 seats and Grandfather S is empty. This is you. This is your decision." For the first time, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossed his face. "It's what's best for the business, Joyce." "Best for the business?" I had given my entire life to this business. I had sacrificed relationships, hobbies, and the possibility of a family of my own for it. How could my removal possibly be what was best? Then, the final, brutal twist of the knife. Cameron will be taking over operational leadership, Arthur announced, gesturing towards my cousin. Cameron puffed out his chest, the picture of a boy playing dress-up in his father's suit. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. Cameron, who couldn't manage his own expense reports, was going to run the operations of a multi-million-dollar company? You can't be serious, I gasped, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. He doesn't know the first thing about logistics or supply chains or personnel management. He'll run this company into the ground in 6 months. That's enough, Arthur snapped, his voice cold as steel. This decision is final. The lawyer slid a thick folder across the table towards me. This is your severance agreement, Ms. Sterling. It's a generous offer, conditional upon the signing of a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-compete agreement. Generous. They were offering to pay me to disappear quietly, to sign away my right to speak, to work, to exist in the industry I had helped build. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over me, leaving me trembling. But beneath the shock and the pain, a cold, hard anger began to form. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and I didn't see the man who taught me to ride a bike or checked my homework. I saw a stranger, a ruthless CEO who would discard his own daughter for reasons I couldn't yet comprehend. And I looked at Cameron, my goofy, incompetent cousin, and saw a weasel who had somehow manipulated his way into a position of power he could never have earned. No, I said, my voice shaking but firm. I'm not signing anything until my lawyer has reviewed it. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Don't make this difficult, Joyce. Difficult? I shot back, my voice gaining strength. You're firing me without cause, without warning, and replacing me with him. You're the one who made this difficult. He signaled to someone outside the room. The door opened, and 2 security guards, men I'd known for years, men who always greeted me with a warm, "Good morning, Ms. Joyce," walked in. They looked ashamed, avoiding my gaze. Please escort Joyce to her office to collect her personal belongings. She is to be off the premises in 15 minutes. The final indignity. Being marched out of my own company like a common criminal. I didn't say another word. I held my head high, turned my back on my father and my traitorous cousin, and walked out of the room, the guards trailing behind me like a funeral procession. The severance was complete. I had been cut off not just from my job, but from my family, my identity, and my entire life's work. The 15 minutes they gave me to pack up 15 years of my life was the most surreal experience I've ever had. My office, once a sanctuary of productivity and ambition, suddenly felt alien. The photos on my desk, one of my grandfather and me at the factory, another of a younger, happier version of my father and me at my graduation, mocked me. I moved in a daze, throwing personal items into a cardboard box with numb, clumsy fingers. My team members watched from their cubicles, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and sympathy. No one said a word. The presence of the security guards ensured their silence. As they walked me to the elevator, I saw Cameron standing outside what used to be my office, talking on his phone and laughing. He was already measuring the drapes. The elevator doors closed, and as the ground floor rushed up to meet me, the full weight of the betrayal finally hit me. I didn't just lose a job. I lost my past and my future in one fell swoop. The first few days were a blur of anger and grief. I sat in my silent apartment, the box of my office life sitting unopened in the corner. I replayed that final scene in the conference room over and over, trying to make sense of the senseless. Why would my father do this? Was it purely to satisfy Cameron's ambition? Was my aunt, his sister, involved? It felt like a palace coup, a Shakespearean betrayal playing out in a modern corporate setting. I ignored the calls and texts that flooded my phone, some from concerned colleagues, others from so-called family friends offering hollow platitudes. The severance agreement sat on my coffee table, a constant, menacing reminder of their attempt to buy my silence. My father had even sent a courier with a ridiculously expensive pen to make the signing easier. The arrogance was astounding. I needed legal advice, but I didn't want just any lawyer. I needed someone who understood the history, the family, the very soul of the company. There was only one person who fit that description, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had been our family's legal counsel for decades, a close friend of my grandfather's, and the sharpest legal mind I knew. She had retired a few years ago, but she was more than just a lawyer. She was a bastion of integrity. She had helped my grandfather draft the original corporate charter. If anyone could help me see a way through this, it was her. I found her number and called, my hands trembling. When she heard my voice and the story of what had happened, her response was not one of surprise, but of quiet, simmering rage. "That fool," she said, her voice crackling with indignation. "Arthur always had more ambition than sense. Meet me at my home office tomorrow morning. And Joyce, don't sign a thing." Walking into Eleanor's study was like stepping into a sanctuary of wisdom. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and the air smelled of old paper and lemon tea. Eleanor, with her sharp eyes and impeccably tailored blazer, looked more like a reigning queen than a retiree. She listened patiently as I recounted the entire story, from the subtle changes in my father's behavior to the humiliating exit from the building. When I finished, she simply nodded. "Power and paranoia, my dear," she said. "It's a classic story. An aging king sees a competent successor and starts to fear his own obsolescence. He'd rather hand the kingdom to a fool he can control than a daughter who might outshine him." She then looked at the severance agreement I'd brought with me, scanning it with an expert eye. "Standard intimidation tactics," she scoffed. "The non-compete is laughably broad. They want to put you in a cage." Then she asked a question that changed everything. "Joyce, where is your original employment contract? The one you signed when you were promoted to COO?" I blinked. "My contract, I haven't looked at that in years. It should be at the office in my personnel file." "No," Eleanor said, a strange intensity in her voice. "Arthur may be a fool, but he isn't stupid. If that contract says what I think it says, he'd never let you get your hands on it. Did you ever keep a copy for yourself?" My mind raced. I was meticulous about paperwork. I had a filing cabinet at home filled with old financial statements, tax returns, and important documents. I remembered when I was promoted, it was a huge moment for me. I had brought the contract home to read over before signing. Surely I would have kept a copy. I rushed home, my heart pounding with a strange mix of hope and desperation. I tore through my files, pulling out drawer after drawer. And then, there it was. In a folder labeled Sterling Personal, tucked away behind old performance reviews, was a pristine copy of my COO employment agreement, signed 10 years ago by both myself and my father. I brought it back to Eleanor's house, and we spread it out on her large mahogany desk. She went straight to Section 4, Termination. Her finger traced down the page, past the standard clauses, until it stopped on subsection C. She read it aloud, her voice ringing with triumph. "Termination without cause," she began. "In the event that the employee's position is terminated by the company for any reason other than gross misconduct or criminal negligence, the employee is entitled to a standard severance of 24 months' salary." She paused, looking at me over the rim of her glasses. "That's the standard part. But your grandfather was a clever man. He worried Arthur might one day let his ego get the best of him, so we added something special for you." She continued reading. "Furthermore, under the succession and legacy provision, termination of the employee, who is a direct descendant of the founder, without cause, triggers an immediate and mandatory buyout option. The employee shall have the right to purchase the terminating parties, in this case, your father's, full complement of voting shares at a value determined by the average of the last 3 independent company valuations." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "A buyout option? What does that mean?" Eleanor smiled, a fierce, brilliant smile. "It means, my dear Joyce, that your father didn't just fire you. He handed you a loaded gun. If we can prove this was a termination without cause, and replacing you with an unqualified buffoon like Cameron is Exhibit A, you have the contractual right to buy him out. You can take the company from him." It was a forgotten clause, a piece of ink on a 10-year-old document, a failsafe put in place by a wise old man who knew his own son's weaknesses. It wasn't just a severance package, it was a key to the entire kingdom. My father, in his arrogant haste to depose me, had forgotten it was there. And in that moment, the grief and despair that had crippled me for days were burned away by a new, all-consuming fire, the desire for justice. The game had just changed. The discovery of the buyout clause was like a lightning bolt, illuminating a path forward where before there had only been darkness. But Alina Vance, with her decades of legal experience, was quick to temper my fiery enthusiasm with cool-headed strategy. A right is not a reality until it's enforced, Joyce, she warned, her gaze steady. Arthur will fight this tooth and nail. He will claim there was cause. He will invent performance issues, fabricate insubordination, and paint you as incompetent. We need more than just the contract. We need irrefutable proof that his decision was not a business one, a personal one made in bad faith. We need to build a fortress of evidence around this clause. Her words were sobering. This wouldn't be a simple matter of presenting a document. It would be a war, and my father would use every weapon at his disposal. I needed to find out the real reason behind my ousting. The official line of a new direction was a lie, and I needed to know what truth it was hiding. It was time to go from being a CEO in exile to a private investigator. My first move was to reach out to my network within the company. These weren't just colleagues, they were people I had hired, mentored, and supported for years. I started with Sarah, the head of human resources. I invited her for coffee at a small, out-of-the-way cafe far from the corporate district. She was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, but her loyalty to me ran deep. "Joyce, it's a disaster," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "Cameron is completely out of his depth. He tried to streamline the payroll process yesterday and almost delayed paychecks for the entire company. Arthur is covering for him, cleaning up his messes, and telling everyone that Cameron is just finding his footing." I asked her about my own termination. Was there any official reason documented? Any performance warnings in my file? Sarah shook her head vehemently. "Absolutely not. Your file is spotless. Perfect reviews, commendations, everything. In fact, Arthur requested a copy of your entire personnel file the day before he fired you. I thought it was for your annual review. Now I realize he was probably looking for dirt and came up empty." This was crucial. The lack of a paper trail proving my incompetence was a significant piece of our puzzle, but I still didn't have the why. Why Cameron? Why now? The answer, I suspected, lay not in the boardroom, but in the family's finances. My next call was to David, the company's longtime controller. David was a quiet, numbers-oriented man nearing retirement who had been hired by my grandfather. He was meticulous, discreet, and had a deep-seated sense of right and wrong. He agreed to meet me in a public library, a place of hushed tones and anonymity. I found him in the history section, pretending to browse a book on ancient civilizations. "This is highly irregular, Joyce," he began, not looking at me. "But what your father did was an affront to your grandfather's memory." I got straight to the point. "David, have you seen any unusual financial activity? Large withdrawals, strange investments, anything involving my father or Cameron personally?" David's eyes darted around before he spoke in a low voice. "Your father has been leveraging his company shares for a series of high-risk personal investments over the past year. Tech startups, cryptocurrency, all of them have gone south. He's underwater, Joyce, deeply. From what I can piece together, he's lost millions." My blood ran cold. My father had always been a conservative investor, preaching fiscal responsibility. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad enough that the banks are calling in his loans. He needed to free up capital, but selling his shares in sterling would mean losing his controlling interest. He was in a bind." Suddenly, the pieces began to click into place. "And Cameron? Your cousin has been whispering in his ear for months," David continued. "I've overheard them. Cameron has a friend, a so-called venture capitalist, who has been feeding your father these can't-miss opportunities. I suspect Cameron has been getting a cut of the action. They've been using the company's good name to secure lines of credit for their side ventures." It was a conspiracy. A pathetic, greedy conspiracy. Cameron wasn't just incompetent, he was a parasite, and he had latched onto my father's financial desperation and ego. He likely convinced Arthur that I, with my cautious, data-driven approach, was an obstacle to the kind of aggressive growth and risky financial shell games they wanted to pursue. Replacing me with Cameron gave them unchecked control over the company's direction and finances. They weren't just pushing me out, they were planning to gut the company my grandfather built to cover their own personal gambling debts. The betrayal was deeper and dirtier than I could have ever imagined. David had one more piece of information. There's a board meeting scheduled for the end of the month. Arthur is going to propose a new strategic investment fund. It's a shell game, Joyce. He's planning to divert company profits into it to pay off his personal creditors. He's going to use Cameron as his puppet to vote it through. The timeline was clear. I had until the end of the month to act. I now had the motive and the evidence of bad faith. I had Sarah's testimony about my clean record and the suddenness of my dismissal. I had David's insider knowledge of my father's financial ruin and the planned corporate malfeasance. These whispers in Th. E. Walls had given me the ammunition I needed. I took all of it back to Alina. She listened intently, her fingers steepled under her chin. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "This is it," she said, her voice firm. "This is not just wrongful termination. It's a breach of fiduciary duty to the company. He is actively working against the best interests of Sterling Innovations to save his own skin." She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the city. Arthur has scheduled a board meeting to gut the company. What he doesn't realize is that we're going to use that very meeting to execute the buyout clause. We're not just going to sue him, Joyce. We are going to walk into that room and take his company away from him, right before his eyes. With less than 2 weeks until the board meeting, Alina and I moved with the precision of a military operation. Our objective was clear: to flawlessly execute the buyout clause and save Sterling Innovations from my father and cousin's disastrous plans. Every step had to be perfect, every detail accounted for. There was no room for error. The first phase was securing the financing. The buyout clause gave me the right to purchase my father's shares, but a right is useless without the capital to exercise it. The valuation, based on the average of the last 3 years, came to a staggering but manageable figure. I wasn't liquid enough to cover it on my own, not even close. I needed a bank to believe in me and my vision for the company's future, and to do it in complete secrecy. Alina made a call to a trusted contact at a private merchant bank, a woman named Elizabeth who valued discretion and smart investments above all else. Our meeting with Elizabeth was in a sterile, soundproofed conference room that felt miles away from the dirty family drama unfolding. I laid out my case, not with emotion, but with data. I presented my 15-year track record as COO, the growth charts, the efficiency metrics, the successful projects. I then presented the evidence David had given me, anonymized, of course, showing the company's current healthy state, and contrasted it with the reckless, strategic investment fund my father was planning to propose. I wasn't just a wronged daughter. I was a proven executive with a plan to protect a valuable asset from mismanagement. "My father's plan will bankrupt the company within 2 years," I stated calmly. "My plan will see it double in value in 5. Elizabeth listened, her expression unreadable. She reviewed the employment contract, her eyes lingering on the forgotten clause. She asked sharp, pointed questions about my business plan, my leadership team, and my strategy for a smooth transition. After 2 intense hours, she closed the folder in front of her. "It's a bold move, Ms. Sterling," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "And a risky one. But we don't bet on contracts, we bet on people. We'll back you. The funds will be ready to be wired upon the execution of the purchase agreement." A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. The biggest hurdle had been cleared. The second phase was legal preparation. Alina was in her element, drafting the official notice of intent to exercise the buyout option, the share purchase agreement, and a cease and desist letter for my father regarding any further financial decisions. She also prepared motions for an emergency injunction to freeze the company's assets if he refused to comply peacefully. "We prepare for war, Joyce, in the hopes of achieving a swift surrender," she explained, her pen flying across a legal pad. "When we walk into that boardroom, we will present Arthur with a checkmate. He can either knock over his king gracefully or have the board flipped over by a judge." While Alina handled the legal artillery, my job was to secure the soft power, the loyalty of the company's key personnel. I couldn't risk a mass exodus or internal sabotage after the takeover. I held a series of discreet meetings with the heads of the major departments: manufacturing, R&D, sales. These were the people who formed the backbone of Sterling Innovations. I didn't tell them the full plan, but I spoke to them with candor and respect. I met with Michael, our brilliant head of R&D, at a university library. "Michael," I said, "I know the last few weeks have been unsettling. I can't give you all the details right now, but I am working on a plan to restore stability and integrity to the company. I need to know if I can count on your team to stay focused and trust that a positive change is coming." Michael, who had been clashing with Cameron's nonsensical demands for flashier products, looked me straight in the eye. "Joyce, you have our loyalty. You always have. Just tell us what you need." I had similar conversations with the heads of sales and manufacturing. The response was unanimous. They were professionals who were tired of the chaos Cameron had introduced and fearful of the direction Arthur was taking the company. They missed my leadership. Their support was not just a morale boost, it was a critical asset. It meant that when I took control, the company's engine wouldn't stall. The final piece of the puzzle was the timing. The board meeting was our stage. The agenda, which Arthur had circulated, was almost laughably arrogant. Item 1 was the ratification of Cameron as the new COO. Item 2 was the approval of the Sterling Strategic Investment Fund. My father intended to use this meeting to legitimize his coup and begin siphoning money out of the company. He had no idea he was actually setting the stage for his own downfall. Alina and I choreographed our entrance down to the second. She, as a former legal counsel and a figure of immense respect, would have no trouble gaining access to the meeting. I, as the aggrieved party with a contractual claim, had every right to be there. We would let Arthur begin his meeting. We would let him get to item 1, the confirmation of Cameron. Then, just as he was about to call for a vote, we would make our move. The days leading up to the meeting were a storm of adrenaline and anxiety. I barely slept, my mind racing through every possible scenario. What if he refused? What if he caused a scene? What if one of our key allies got cold feet? But whenever doubt crept in, I thought of my grandfather's face in the portrait on the wall. He had built a legacy of quality and honor. My father and cousin were turning it into a personal piggy bank. I wasn't just doing this for myself. I was doing it for him, for the employees who depended on the company, and for the name that I still, despite everything, carried with pride. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The final act was about to begin. The day of the board meeting arrived with a cold, gray sky that matched the knot of ice in my stomach. I dressed meticulously in a dark navy suit, my armor for the battle to come. When I met Alina in the lobby of her building, she gave me a firm, approving nod. She was wearing a deep charcoal pantsuit and carried a leather briefcase that held my father's corporate fate. We didn't speak much on the drive to the Sterling Innovations headquarters. There was nothing left to say. The plan was in motion, and all that remained was its execution. Walking into that building felt different. For the first time in my life, I wasn't an employee or an executive. I was an outsider, an invader. But as we walked past the reception desk, the receptionist gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. It was a tiny gesture, but it fortified my resolve. We arrived at the executive floor and walked straight to the main conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see them, my father at the head of the table, looking confident and powerful, and Cameron next to him, fidgeting with his tie, a smug look on his face. The company's CFO was also present, looking deeply uncomfortable. They hadn't started yet. We paused outside the door, taking a deep breath. "Ready?" Alina asked quietly. I nodded. "Let's begin." We pushed the doors open and walked in. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. 3 heads swiveled towards us, their expressions shifting from surprise to shock to, in my father's case, pure fury. "Joyce, what is the meaning of this?" Arthur boomed, rising from his chair. "This is a private board meeting. You are no longer an officer of this company. You are trespassing." Cameron just gaped at me, his mouth hanging open like a fish. Eleanor Vance stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. "On the contrary, Arthur," she said, her voice calm and clear. "My client is here as a key shareholder and to address a matter of urgent corporate governance. According to the company's bylaws, which I helped your father draft, she has every right to be here." She placed her briefcase on the table with a solid thud. My father sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "This is absurd. Security." Before he could do anything, Eleanor continued, her voice cutting through his anger. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. It would only add another layer to the lawsuit." She looked him directly in the eye. "We are here to discuss Joyce's termination." "It's already been discussed and settled," Arthur sneered. "She was offered a generous severance." "A severance she did not accept," Eleanor countered smoothly. "Because her termination was without cause, a fact made obvious by your decision to replace a 15-year COO with a marketing intern." Cameron flinched as if he'd been slapped. "And," Eleanor continued, her timing perfect, "that termination without cause triggered a provision in her employment contract. A provision you seem to have forgotten. The succession and legacy clause." A flicker of confusion, then dawning horror, crossed my father's face. He remembered. I saw the exact moment the blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and shaken. He sank back into his chair. "That clause," he whispered. I finally spoke, my voice steady and strong, betraying none of the turmoil I felt inside. "The clause that gives me the right to purchase your controlling shares, Dad, the right I am here to exercise today." Eleanor opened her briefcase and slid 3 documents across the polished table. "The first," she announced, "is a formal notice of intent to exercise the buyout option. The second is the share purchase agreement. And the third," she said, pausing for effect, "is a certified cashier's check from Northgate Merchant Bank for the full, legally stipulated purchase price." The CFO, a man named Henderson, picked up the check, his eyes wide with disbelief. He examined it, then looked at me, then at my father. He knew what this meant. The entire power structure of the company had just been upended. My father stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. "You can't do this," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This company is mine." "No," I replied, my voice softening slightly but losing none of its resolve. "It was grandfather's. And you were about to use it as your personal slush fund to cover your bad investments. You were going to destroy his legacy to save yourself. I won't let that happen." Cameron finally found his voice. "This is crazy. Uncle Arthur, don't let her do this," he pleaded. I turned my gaze to him, and for the first time he saw not his cousin, but the woman whose career he had helped destroy. "You," I said, my voice dripping with contempt, "are fired. Please have your desk cleared out in 1 hour. Security will escort you out." He paled and looked to my father for help, but Arthur was defeated. He sat slumped in his chair, a broken man, staring at the check that represented the end of his reign. The reckoning was swift and silent. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. There was only the quiet, brutal efficiency of a well-executed legal maneuver. Eleanor walked my father through the documents, explaining that he could either sign them now or face an injunction and a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty that would expose his financial desperation to the world. He had no choice. With a trembling hand, Arthur Sterling signed away the company his father had built. He signed away his power, his position, and his legacy. As he finished, he finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and defeat. "You are no longer my daughter," he rasped. I met his gaze, my heart aching with the ghost of the father I once loved. "You made that choice long before today," I said quietly. The reckoning was over. I had won. But standing there in that cold conference room, I felt not the elation of victory, but the heavy weight of the crown I had just seized. In the immediate aftermath of the boardroom confrontation, a strange quiet descended. My father and Cameron left the building without another word, shadows slinking away from the empire they had lost. The CFO, Mr. Henderson, looked at me with a newfound respect and a touch of fear. "Ms. Sterling," he began, "what are your orders?" The question hung in the air, solidifying my new reality. I was in charge. The weight of it was immense, but it was a burden I had been preparing for my entire life. My first order of business was to stabilize the company and reassure our employees. An all-hands meeting was called for that afternoon. Standing before the men and women I had worked alongside for years, I didn't speak of betrayal or family drama. I spoke of the future. I laid out my vision for Sterling Innovations, a return to my grandfather's core principles of quality and integrity, coupled with a renewed commitment to innovation and growth. I announced the promotions of several key, deserving managers who had been overlooked by my father. I promised transparency and stability. As I spoke, I could feel the tension and fear in the room slowly dissipating, replaced by a cautious optimism. The company had a leader again, one they knew and trusted. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor Vance guided me through the legal and financial intricacies of the transition, her wisdom a constant source of strength. We conducted a thorough audit, uncovering the full extent of the financial mess my father had created. It was worse than we thought. He had taken out risky loans against the company's assets and was days away from defaulting. The strategic investment fund he was planning would have been the final nail in the coffin. We spent months restructuring the debt, cutting off the toxic financial ties, and putting the company back on solid ground. It was grueling work, requiring long hours and tough decisions, but with every problem solved, I felt the company healing. I felt myself healing. I was no longer just Arthur Sterling's daughter or the wronged COO. I was the CEO, forging a new path for the company and for myself. My relationship with my Amy Lee was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed. My father refused to speak to me. My aunt, Cameron's mother, sent me a single, venomous text message calling me a traitor. The silence from that side of the family was painful, a constant reminder of the price of my victory. But in losing them, I found a different kind of family. The employees of Sterling Innovations rallied around me with a loyalty that was both humbling and inspiring. David, the controller, and Sarah, the head of HR, became my trusted advisors. The senior management team I put in place worked with a renewed sense of purpose. We were a team, united in our mission to not just save the company, but to make it better than it had ever been before. I also made a point to reconnect with the parts of myself I had sacrificed for the job. I started taking weekends off. I reconnected with old friends. I even adopted a dog from a local shelter, a scruffy terrier mix named Gus, whose unconditional affection was a balm to my soul. My sterile apartment slowly started to feel like a home. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was a life of my own making, one filled with genuine purpose and quiet joy. About a year after the takeover, I received a letter from a law firm representing my father. He was selling his house and moving away. He had lost everything: his company, his reputation, and the respect of the business community. Cameron, I heard through the grapevine, had bounced around a few sales jobs before moving back in with his parents, his brief taste of power having ruined him for actual work. There was no satisfaction in their downfall, only a profound sense of sadness for the man my father used to be. My victory wasn't about their destruction, it was about the preservation of my grandfather's legacy. One evening, I was working late, reviewing the designs for a new product line, something my father had deemed too risky. It was innovative, ambitious, and I knew it was going to be a huge success. As I sat in the CEO's office, my office, looking out at the sparkling city lights, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I had been fired, betrayed, and escorted out of the building I grew up in, but I found my strength in the fine print of a forgotten contract and in the integrity of those who stood by me. I hadn't just taken back my job, I had taken back my life. I was no longer a princess waiting for her inheritance. I was a queen who had built her own throne. And from here, the future looked limitless. I was finally free, forging a new path not just for Sterling Innovations, but for myself.